Okay, I've been trying to start this video. My friend keeps texting me, but now we're on chapter 5 in the American Government book. Again, the free textbook. That's the links on the syllabus and things I posted, and we're discussing now civil rights. And again, like I said with chapter 4, I think chapters 4 and 5 of this reading are probably the most interesting and most important. And again, I like the last chapter in the reading as well on foreign policy. But let's just move into this. And again, hopefully have a lot of good discussions. And remember, with this homework, there's definitely a homework. With this reading, there's definitely a homework that should be done while you're seeing this video. So make sure you're doing that accommodations homework and kind of thinking about these kind of critical questions that actually no one really has a good answer to. You might have different perspectives, but they're just kind of hard to suss out in real life. So we have here, civil rights are concerned with citizens having equal opportunity and equal treatment under the law. This section of the readings covers a variety of groups that have struggled to attain fully realized civil rights in the U.S. Although much progress regarding civil rights has been achieved, there are still instances of unjust discrimination, unequal treatment meaning, that occur in the U.S. today. This chapter focuses mostly on civil rights struggles of Black Americans and women. However, it is important that we read through these other groups. And so that's just really a function of time. I think much of the center of gravity of other groups, obviously women are not a minority, but there have been a group that hasn't been necessarily treated equally under the law, kind of revolve around the struggle that African Americans went through. So that's kind of why we spend more time on it. But please read the readings regarding, say, Native Americans, Latino Americans, gay Americans, because they had their own distinct struggles as well. And we do have questions on the tests on things like that. So what is a civil right? What distinguishes from a civil liberty, which is a protection against or from the government? So having a gun is a civil liberty, right? The right to bear arms. Civil rights, these are guarantees by the government that it will treat people equally. So again, this is a relationship that the people have with the government, not with each other. So I can be hateful or I can discriminate against people. And also one of the things that we'll talk about, and hopefully this spurs conversation, you and me are actually totally fine with discrimination. We are all totally fine with justifiable discrimination, right? And this is a big difference. And so even with regards to the government, we want the person who wins the most votes. We're going to discriminate against the person who has the least votes. So we want the reasons why we discriminate to be justifiable. Things that don't seem justifiable are, arbitrarily telling someone where they can go or what they can do or what schools they can go to or where they can live based on things that are not contingent upon, say, living or eating in a restaurant or riding in a bus, your gender, your sex, your sexual orientation, your religion. There's a litany more of these things, your ethnicity and things like that, the language you speak. So keep that in mind. The classic example, before I get more into this, would be something along the lines of, you are all in favor of like a justifiable discrimination when getting jobs because you, if you get an A in this class, don't want to be treated the same. You want unequal treatment than someone who receives an F in this class. You don't want to just go to the class and go, oh, we all get equal treatment, and that's the world's better. So this is kind of important with all these kind of rhetoric and just public discussions of, say, equity, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. No reasonable person usually wants this kind of unnuanced kind of just strict equality. You want the person who works the hardest, has the best resume, to get the job that pays a lot of money. You don't want the random person coming off the street, right? So there are areas where maybe merit doesn't matter or treatment from the government, like what schools you go to, the quality of education. Those are the kind of the equitable outcomes or the equality of treatment that people are talking about, right? So just because you are born in a poor neighborhood doesn't mean you necessarily deserve less of an education, right? You want that same education so that you can have the opportunities to get out of a poor neighborhood, right? So it's kind of hard to discern. These things all tied up together, but these are very, very important issues to pay attention to and kind of suss out in your mind as best you can, and ask me questions if it's confusing. So the actual aspect of equality is referenced in the Declaration of Independence, and we would have done that for our first homework assignment, second homework assignment. The Fifth Amendment also talks about due process, which is owed to everyone equally. So again, these aspects of equality are already in the Constitution, but they just were not sufficient to kind of overcome human psychology, xenophobia. Racism, unfortunately, is just kind of something that all cultures have and probably will have throughout time. And we erected it into kind of like essentially the systemic framework of our country. And I think for the most part, we've eliminated a lot of that. But again, there are a lot of people right now saying that we haven't done a good enough job. We need to do better. And then we get into like this 14th Amendment. So this is really, really important. I kind of mentioned this last time. After, say the First and the Fifth and the right to privacy, this is probably the amendment you guys want to know the best. You folks want to know the best. And really you want to make sure you pay attention to this key term, the Equal Protection Clause. So no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So one, this actually allowed segregation to take place and to end. And this is why, against essentially when people essentially come to say the border, which I mentioned last time, of the United States, and they request asylum or things like that, once they become part of the American legal process, it does not matter if they're not citizens. They are due their day in court to petition the court for, say, asylum, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate, it doesn't matter. The American laws, because of the 14th Amendment, apply to people who are under the jurisdiction of the United States, which clearly you are if you're at the border interacting with Border Patrol. If that makes sense. So how did the 14th Amendment actually cause segregation to take place? Because that's where you get the whole rhetoric with regards to Jim Crow laws of separate but equal. So the South decided to kind of play word games, go, we are treating people equally, we're just going to have people treated separately, which meets the letter of the law, perhaps not the intention of the law. That's, if you go to law school, that's always one of these tensions that arises with, say, legal policies and aspects, is that does the intention match the outcome of what the law produces? And oftentimes laws have to get changed or get rid of if they don't actually fulfill the purpose they were intended to do. Equal Protection Clause holds that people of similar circumstances shall be treated equally alike, but if people's circumstances are different, it is justifiable. So that goes back to my kind of opening monologue there. It is justifiable, meaning legal, to treat them differently. This idea also relates to the concept of accommodation, which our homework is about. And so why do you get to treat people differently? I'll give you an example, and then hopefully we had examples you considered in the homework. If I'm a man, it doesn't seem like that's going to have an impact on my ability to drive. If I can see and have the ability to manipulate the steering wheel and push the pedals, I should be allowed to drive, right? I get a license from the government, right? You go to the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles. But if I'm blind, that doesn't. So being a man is not relevant to me driving, but being blind does, because you have to be able to kind of perceive the world around you in order to be a safe driver. So we do discriminate against blind people. We say you cannot have that freedom, you cannot have that privilege of driving because you are a harm, right? So that's justifiable. That's a justifiable reason. Actually, bringing up the driving example, what's interesting about that though is actually insurance companies discriminate all the time. And I know we have all these kind of rhetoric, but they actually discriminate against men. So statistically speaking, for whatever reason, whether it's physiological, psychological, cultural, or whatever the case may be, biological men tend to drive more unsafely than women do. And therefore, because of that justifiable reason, insurance companies can treat men and women differently and essentially discriminate against men by charging them higher insurance rates, right? So the reason why the insurance rates are higher for men is because there is a body of evidence that shows men on average drive in a less safe, right? They're more prone to accidents. And if you're a really well driving safe man, you're like, that's not fair. Well, legally speaking, it's legal, although it may not be seen morally fair. That's where we get these differences between the law and morality. Another idea with regards to accommodation, which hopefully I started talking about, or we talked about, or are talking about in our Zoom session too, is unequal treatment always isn't not allowing someone to do something, right? Unequal treatment can apply to things that we have to do. So again, we had that distinction between, say, positive duties and negative duties. So we could, we have this kind of duty to prevent people from driving if they don't have the ability to. But we also have the duty of, perhaps with regards, again, with, say, people who are disabled, to providing accommodations for them. And for the most part, we oftentimes take these things for granted. So again, you guys probably all walk around, especially now during COVID, and you'll notice whenever you come to a curb, the curb slants down on the street. That's all because of the Americans with Disability Act, and people in wheelchairs could not what would be the words? I'm missing a good word here, but they couldn't move around, basically, the world in which we all share, like the public space. And so they weren't being treated equally. So now the public, taxpayer dollars, have to maybe have these more costly kind of ramps for people, but also businesses do too, right? And so it may not be fair to the business owner because they're going to have to pay money to have this accommodation, but we've all decided, well, this is fair. We have to do these things for people who perhaps cannot walk or are in wheelchairs, because it makes the system more equal. Equal in terms of access, but not equal in regards of treatment. So again, what equality applies to is very different. These issues are not as cut and dry as I think many of us think they are, or in which the way the media portrays them. And that's the good thing about going to college, right? So we have equality of, say, access or treatment in the public space, but not access to, say, the business owner, right? So the business owner gets treated differently, say, the homeowner, because they have a public a building, a place of employment that serves the public, and so it has to do so equally. Whereas at my house, if no one in my home is handicapped or disabled in that capacity, I don't have to have a ramp in my house if I don't want to. Right? It's not. There's no law to make me to do that. So that's the difference between, say, the public and the private distinction too. Sorry for rambling there. It's just a really, really important issue. I really want to focus on that. I do have test questions on that. A lot of my test questions are comprehension questions. They're not just memorization questions. And we'll talk about this a little bit more with regards to, like, these different kinds of scrutinies. So we have, thus, between the 5th and 14th Amendments, neither the state nor federal governments may treat people unequally unless unequal, I'll probably hear treatment. Sorry. Probably getting that quote wrong from the reading, but is necessary to maintain important governmental interests, right? So again, the government may justify that it has to treat people equally for this kind of interest of society, which gets us into our next kind of section, right? So again, not even the government is bound to treat everyone equal, this kind of flat, unnuanced equality across the board, if it finds justification not to do so. So when exceptions for equality are made, the government must demonstrate that it has a good reason for engaging in it. So not arbitrary reasons like, oh, I don't like the way your skin looks, right? It has to be it has to make sense. It has to be a rational reason, a rational in the legal sense, not necessarily the philosophical sense. So when courts consider cases regarding discrimination, they apply what's legally known as a rational bias test. So again, key terms to know. These tests try to assess whether there is a reason for treating some people differently that is rationally related to the legitimate government interests. So again, then I'm not with all these things, but say intermittent scrutiny. And the book talks about, say, biological sex. So again, like there might be cases where you can treat people differently with regards to sex. You know, biological men on the bell curve on average are stronger than women. And so there might be reasons with regards to, say, the military where there's certain jobs that men can do because it relies on strength and women can't do. These things have changed over time, obviously, with like the CrossFit revolution. People are going, whoa, maybe a lot of women can do these kinds of things. But again, it's not arbitrary because they're women. It has to do with regards to, say, strength, something like that. Strict scrutiny has to do with things more like with regard to, say, race. Again, so we have this kind of idea like with affirmative action, which I think the California state's doing. We're kind of allowing this kind of discrimination of, say, historically disenfranchised minority groups, particularly Hispanics, Latinos, and Black Americans, because they need access to, say, better education to kind of have better life outcomes. And so we are essentially treating people unequally. We're kind of violating this rule, but it seems like it's justifiable because of like the historic treatment of groups over time, right? Compelling interest is an important term to know, and again, narrowly tailored. So whenever you make these exceptions to the law with regards to narrowly tailored, it has to be like very, very specific. You don't want like a general exception. You want the exception to be like for this particular instance, for these particular reasons. So after the Civil War, in order to push back against the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the Democratic Party lawmakers, particularly in southern states, right, passed black codes. Right, so the Democratic Party very much historically has not been an ally of the black community, and there's reasons why that has changed over time. That's not to say that the Republican Party is the enemy of black Americans. It's just that how black Americans vote has changed. These laws were designed to oppress black Americans. They often denied them access to public schools. The black community in many parts of the country were subjected to violence by whites and not afforded redress by the government. So even when white Americans would violate black Americans' rights, they could not go to the state, which is not being treated equally from the government, not from our neighbors, to fix these problems. Right now, if you were subject to a violent crime, hopefully, if you went to the police, they would do something about it. They would stop it, or at least avail you of the legal process, which black Americans were not afforded. Right, you weren't going to sue the KKK member that burned down your house or killed your family member. Right, so there was just nothing you can do. So to kind of start addressing some of these issues during Reconstruction, the federal government, specifically the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, eventually passed the 14th Amendment, which concerns equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which empowered black men at that time. It wasn't until the 19th Amendment women could vote, but black men to be able to vote, right? Then we get more into the readings, right? Black Americans have had an especially difficult time obtaining fully realized civil rights because their once inferior legal status was written into the Constitution, right? So slavery is part of the Constitution. We needed the 13th Amendment, the fix, to get rid of it. This is a clear instance where the Constitution's inherent conservative framework, meaning slow change. So again, this is a key term that hopefully we've introduced. If not, if this is the first time. Conservative here doesn't mean like Republican, Donald Trump Republican. It means slow to change. It's kind of like this ideological outlook, right? So we're all conservative on certain issues. Like say self-driving cars. Hopefully that all kind of gives us pause. I don't know if I trust a self-driving car. That means you're kind of conservative if you're kind of hesitant. If you just kind of embrace the new technology regardless of the consequences, then you're going to be a much more kind of progressive person. But I think generally when you get to these kind of like radical changes, most people are somewhat conservative in that regard. And again, that does not mean GOP conservative. And so because the Constitution is slow to change, it kind of allowed these abuses of the black community to kind of happen and get worse over time. So much of this history of the struggle is rooted in slavery. As the country began to expand after the Revolutionary War, what to do about slavery became a central preoccupation of the country, right? So again, you don't have to know the history of the Civil War, but there were parts of the country that wanted to get rid of slavery, didn't want it to expand. Some because slavery they found to be morally abhorrent, others because they didn't want to give southern states more political power. So we have here opponents to slavery feared the expansion of slavery would lead to political dominance of the South over the North, right? And would deprive small farmers in newly acquired Western territories who could not afford slaves. Abolitionists, or people who wanted to end slavery primarily in the North, also argued slavery was both immoral and opposed it on basic U.S. values. Right? So again, I have all these court cases. Write down the court cases. Make sure you kind of know what they're about. So we have one, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Basically, a slave owner with his slave. The slave owner died in a free state. The slave sued to gain his freedom, and this court said you don't have any legal standing. You're not a legally recognized person, right? So even though he was in a free state, he had to remain in slavery. So then after the Civil War, the Union victory settled many of the matters caused by the Civil War itself, including slavery. The period immediately after the war is known as Reconstruction, saw many reforms that politically empowered the black community. So again, right after the war, there were senators and congresspeople and different black politicians that were elected to office. The segregation period happened after this period. Members of the Democratic Party moved then to disenfranchise or essentially prohibit people from voting, right? So there wasn't going to be enough of the black community in, say, neighborhoods to vote for the congressperson, right? And so if you made it harder for them to vote, then it's going to be harder to get elected. And if you can't get elected to political office, you can't use political power. So we have these key terms, disenfranchisement, which we already kind of talked about. And these are examples, right? A literacy test, right? So imagine you were in slavery. It's against the law to read. You can be killed. So you never learned how to read. And then now you're a free citizen who can go vote. And now they're going to go, well, there's nothing that says you can't have a test. So we're going to make sure you're smart enough. So you have to read this paragraph. I can't read the paragraph. I was a slave for 50 years. Oh, then I guess you can't vote, right? So that's what literacy tests were. Poll tax is money you have to pay. Okay, imagine you're a slave. You never had a job that paid you money because that's the definition of slavery. And say, hey, you have to pay me 10 cents to vote. I don't have any money. I was a slave yesterday. I guess you can't vote then, right? White primary, same thing. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are private organizations. So because the Democratic Party is a private organization, they didn't want black Americans to participate in their party politics. So they said, we're just going to have white primaries. Only white people can vote on people and policies and things like that. So what resulted from this kind of like removal of black American political power is it allowed southern states to undermine equal treatment mandated by the 14th Amendment. This led to the implementation of segregation, separate but equal, right? So because black Americans couldn't use their political clout to push back against these policies, they eventually became codified into Jim Crow laws, right? So again, these are democratically, voted in laws and policies, but also part of that democratic process is the non-democratic practice of disenfranchising black Americans, right? So we wouldn't call it, say, legitimate democratic practice. And that leads us into Plessy versus Ferguson, and that established segregation. That said, okay, wait, separate but equal is constitutional. Much of the civil rights struggle we reflect on today was the effort after Reconstruction to overturn Jim Crow laws and segregation. This process took several decades to achieve, but be sure to review the important developments that took place during this period, right? So again, one of these developments is Brown versus Board of Education. There's actually a similar case with regards to Mexican Americans in California that predates that. That's in the readings. I think we'll talk about it in a second. But basically, this court case found that Plessy versus Ferguson was not constitutional, and it was illegal to treat people separately but equal. The court decided that, which we'll get to the courts in chapter 14, that it doesn't make sense to have equality by treating people differently. That makes no sense, or separately in that regard. So notice the law didn't change, the interpretation of the law changed. The passage of the 24th Amendment in 1964 banned the federal poll tax. So again, it removed disenfranchising policies. Also in 64, the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act. So again, you want to remember that, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Be sure to renew, on page 166, the nuances. And also in 1965, the Voting Rights Act as well. And then we kind of move into this discussion with regards to, say, women. In the past, when women would marry, their legal identities were erased, right? So women really had no legal standing when they became a married woman, and society was very much geared towards being married. The private property would be transferred in their husband's name and control. So women didn't really have this freedom to, again, it's interesting, again, with all those kind of arguments about democratic socialism. Like one of these kind of things that inspired women to pursue more active political rights was the inability to control their own personal private property, which is what we talked about in the revolutionary period, was what the country itself was pushing back against Great Britain, right? So women were basically making the same arguments that the founders were against Britain itself. Along with suffrage, or meaning the right to vote, women activists like Elizabeth Stanton also pushed for women's right to seek a higher education. So again, this kind of segregation with regards to Black Americans also happened to women. You can't have these jobs, you can't go to these places because you are of the wrong gender or sex, whatever, however you want to think of it. So then in 1920, we see the passage of the 19th Amendment, which might be a test question, which basically granted women the right to vote. And even though women were successful in obtaining the franchise, there remained difficulties in obtaining employment, right? Additionally, we I think it's supposed to say when. Sorry for the typos. Additionally, when employment could be obtained, right, women were often not paid in an equivalent manner to their male counterparts. So that's pretty much been rectified. There are still arguments with regards to the gender pay gap, but for the most part, it's no longer the case that men and women working the same jobs get paid differently, unjustifiably so anyways. Like obviously if you worked longer at a job, you're going to make more, something along those lines. Such realities culminated in the second women's right movement that emerged in the 60s. According to activist Section 7, right, back to our 1964 Civil Rights Act, regarding women was not being sufficiently enforced. So a lot of times it's not just having the laws passed, it's having the laws enforced. And again, we saw that with the segregation policies with regards to Black Americans. Once Brown versus Board of Education was passed, Southern states were going to ignore it. So it took President Kennedy and other presidents to send the National Guard, or essentially the military, to enforce the law. And that's kind of this case that women were making with regards to many of these other kind of policies. The big one here is going to be essentially sexual harassment type of laws and policies. There's a whole history there, but there was no conception of sexual harassment until the 60s and 70s, which you might think it's weird because we just go, yeah, like you can't, grab someone's butt because you want to. But there really was no conception of that prior to these laws and policies getting passed. And then the Equal Rights Amendment, you guys want to read about that, right? So there are several groups and different groups to talk about: Native Americans, Latinos, the LGBTQ community of Americans, and so these are things to read through, be comfortable with. Again, I'm not including them not because they're not important, but it's just for time reasons, right? And again, this is that case I was mentioning earlier that was very much like Brown versus Board of Education. It's almost 10 years, 11 years sooner. And Mendez versus Westminster, the city, which is in the LA area, right? So they sued, Mendez family sued because their kids were not allowed to go to essentially white schools. And yeah, the racial history and how these constructs kind of erected themselves in our history are peculiar in this country. Or there are cases of, Asian Americans in the turn of the last century suing because they were technically saying, I do qualify as a white person. And then the court had to basically make up a new reason because, their this stuff was technically paler than theirs for whatever reason, and so they had to make up new reasons to be racist. And then this Oberfeld versus Hodges has to do with same-sex marriage, right? So that case essentially in 2015, not too long ago, basically legalized same-sex marriage. So that's with regards to, say, gay Americans' civil rights issues. There's a lot here. Again, I really like chapters 4 and 5. I think they're really, really important. There's so much here. There's so much history. Again, this isn't really a history class, but I think knowing these basics, knowing the difference between a civil right and civil liberty are things that are going to be on the test. Knowing the importance of the 14th Amendment and these different court cases, and having an understanding of these things will really put you in a good situation to do well and do well in this class and well in these tests. So again, ask me questions, email me questions if these things aren't clear, and I look forward to talking to you guys and answering this stuff in class. So see you in the next video.